Hello everyone, a very good evening and welcome to Byju's Exam Prep. Welcome to our weekly current affairs webinar. As you know, every Tuesday we cover the last week's important current affairs, both from a prelims and as well as mains point of view. Today we have 8 important topics chosen from last week's current affairs. We shall be covering all these topics in detail so that you should be able to answer any prelims question or even a mains question related to these topics. The first 4 topics, especially, they are bigger topics relevant for both prelims and mains. The last 4 are largely prelims oriented. Before I begin, I'm sure all of you know that UPSC has announced the results for last year. We are happy to say that, as per the initial estimate, we have 4 top rankers in the top 20. The mock interviews of these students will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. It's already there available. Please go ahead and watch. And I'm saying this because this will motivate you. It will inspire you to prepare well for your next attempt. The toppers, they have set an example. Take them as role models. Look at how they have prepared. Take some lessons from their strategy, and that will help you in your exams as well. So take a look at these mock interviews just as a source of motivation. And I really hope each one of you clears the exam next year. Or maybe those who are writing this year, all the very best for you guys. So let's start with the first topic. We'll look at a very important law that was in the news, the POSH Act, which stands for Prevention of Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act. First, let me give you the context, why this topic has been in news, and then we'll understand all the details. The POSH Act was in news because recently Indian wrestlers, top Indian wrestlers, they protested for several days in New Delhi, calling for strict action to be taken against the head of the Wrestling Foundation of India. He was accused of sexual harassment charges against Indian wrestlers, and this led to a huge controversy, a national controversy. In this regard, this law, which protects women against sexual harassment at workplace, was in news. And also last week, the Supreme Court of India has reviewed this legislation because it has been 10 years since the law has been implemented. This law was enacted by the Indian Parliament back in 2013. So 1 decade after its implementation, the Supreme Court was looking at its implementation. It was reviewing the progress made under this law. There were several related cases in which women were trying to seek justice for the sexual harassment that they would have faced at workplaces. So, in the context of these litigations, the Supreme Court reviewed the POSH Act after 1 decade. During this review, the Supreme Court has made a very serious observation, a very disturbing observation, that the law has serious lapses. There are certain shortcomings in the law, and there is uncertainty regarding its implementation. Meaning, the Supreme Court has pointed out the legal lacuna in this law. It has pointed out the flaws in its implementation, and it has urged the government, the central government, the state government, and the district authorities to be very serious about the implementation of this act. It has issued directions as well to the union government, the states, and the union territories to ensure that the mandatory internal complaint committees, which have to be set up under the act, are constituted in every company and institution which employs more than 10 workers. These strict directions have been issued by the Supreme Court as a follow-up to the review of the POSH Act. So it's in this context that the topic was making a lot of news last week. So let's understand more about the Prevention of Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act. Let's look at the context in which this law was brought out. There's a very interesting development behind it. Let's also talk about the provisions. Let's understand the composition of the Internal Complaints Committee. And finally, we'll discuss the shortcomings in the law, where things are going wrong under the POSH Act, and discuss a way forward. So that if there is any prelims question, you should be able to easily answer them. And even if there is an analytical mains question, you should be able to write a detailed answer for this question. The topic is very, very important for polity and as well as for social issues. Is that clear? So let's look at the background first. In the year 1992, there was a very unfortunate incident that happened in Rajasthan. There was a woman known as Banwari Lal Devi who was working as a social worker on behalf of the government of Rajasthan. The government of Rajasthan was implementing a women development project, and Banwari Lal Devi was a social worker who was associated with this project. One of the tasks that was given to this task force was to reach out to villages in Rajasthan and prevent child marriages from taking place. I hope you know that in Rajasthan and in few other states, child marriage remains a major social issue even today. So, Banwari Lal Devi, as a social worker, tried to prevent the marriage of a 1 year old girl. Can you imagine that? A 1 year old baby girl was being married off by her own family. This is a persistent social issue in the Indian society. And as a social worker, Banwari Lal Devi tried to stop this marriage. So, in retaliation, some of the local members, they raped Banwari Lal Devi. She was gang raped. This case was actually buried for a number of months. It was only later that the incident came to light, and few NGOs came up to take up this case to provide justice to Banwari Lal Devi. One of the NGOs which fought the case, one of the activist group which argued in this case, was the Vishaka group. Their argument in front of the court was Banwari Lal Devi was harassed, sexually harassed and raped at her workplace. So they urged the court to provide a strict punishment to the perpetrators of this heinous crime, because a government worker, that too at the place of work, had been gang raped. This led the court to take notice of the situation in India, that we didn't even have a law in place to protect women at workplace. That is when the Supreme Court noted the absence of such a law that could provide for gender equality and security for women and justice for women, specifically against sexual harassment at workplaces. After years of hearings and litigations, finally in 1997, the Supreme Court laid down a series of guidelines, which is known as the Vishaka Guidelines. As Vishaka Group was mainly leading the argument on behalf of the victim, these guidelines have been named after Vishaka Group. It's called the Vishaka Guidelines. This was a landmark moment in India's legal history and judicial history. Because since there was an absence of a law, the parliament, the government hadn't acted in this regard, the Supreme Court had to step in and provide for a set of guidelines to be followed at every workplace, be it a government office, a private company, or an NGO, or even government officials who are working in the field, like Banwari Lal Devi. At any kind of workplace, women workers are protected through the Vishaka Guidelines. So this became a landmark legislation of the Supreme Court, and these guidelines became the norm when it came to sexual harassment at workplaces. So this highlighted the need for a law, a specific legislation enacted by the parliament which could fill this legal vacuum. So for several years, the Vishaka Guidelines were in operation. Then finally, the government of India woke up and initiated the process to bring in a law to replace the Vishaka Guidelines. After several rounds of debates and discussions within the parliament and with the civil society and within the government, finally, the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Bill was brought out by the Ministry of Women and Child Development. This was in 2007. After almost 1 decade of the Vishaka judgment, the government finally brought out a bill to protect women at workplaces against sexual harassment. Now, if let's say UPSC focuses on the Vishaka judgment, which is a landmark judgment in India, there might be a possible question as to on what basis did the Supreme Court pass these guidelines. Wasn't the Supreme Court stepping into the domain of the executive, into the domain of the legislature while passing these guidelines? So on what legal basis did the Supreme Court bring out these guidelines? That could be a possible question. The Supreme Court based its judgment by drawing the powers from Article 15 Article 15 is a fundamental right that guarantees the prohibition of discrimination on the grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, and place of birth. Inherently within Article 15, gender equality and gender justice is built into it. So this was one key constitutional provision that the Supreme Court relied upon while bringing out the Vishaka guidelines. The second basis was India's international commitment to the CEDAW Convention of the United Nations. Under the UN, we have the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This convention, which was brought out by the UN, it was ratified by India in 1993, in the same decade. So India was committed to prohibit and eliminate all kinds of discrimination against women, which includes sexual harassment against women at workplaces. So on this basis as well, the Supreme Court based its judgment in the Vishaka case. So based on Article 15 and India's commitment to the CEDAW Convention, the Supreme Court of India laid down the Vishaka guidelines. So kindly make a note of this. This in itself could be an important point for your prelims. Is that clear? Next, let's see how the law was finally enacted. So since the Supreme Court has given the push to bring in a legislation, the Ministry of Women and Child Development brought out the bill in 2007, and following several rounds of debates within the parliament, there were many amendments that were carried out to the bill, and finally the law was enacted in 2013. So essentially this law which we have today, which is a primary law against sexual harassment at workplaces, it took nearly 2 decades. There is a 2-decade background behind this. The case started in 1992, 1993. Vishaka judgment came in 97. The bill was tabled in 2007. And finally, it was enacted by the parliament in 2013. So that is why the POSH Act is a very, very important piece of legislation as far as securing justice to women is concerned. So now, let me take you through the key provisions. The key provisions of the Act, it can be very important for your prelims and also for your mains as well. You can expect a detailed question here. UPSC can ask you about the background to the Vishaka judgment or the provisions of the POSH Act, where you have to analyze the provisions and carry out a critical analysis. So that is why it's important to understand the key provisions as well. See, according to the POSH Act, sexual harassment at workplace has been clearly defined. This is one of the most important provisions. It defines as to what constitutes sexual harassment against women at workplaces. It includes any unnecessary physical contact. If a male employee, right, could be the manager of the woman employee, could be colleagues, could be subordinates, right, could be anyone at the workplace. If a male employee is unnecessarily physically touching the woman, that constitutes to be sexual harassment. Any inappropriate sexual advances at workplace or in the context of the work environment, right? Even that constitutes sexual harassment. Any demand or request for sexual favors in the name of promotions, in the name of providing favorable reviews. If superiors are seeking sexual favors, that is clearly a case of sexual harassment. Making sexually colored remarks, showing pornography, showing any explicit visuals, any other unwelcome physical, verbal, or even non-verbal conduct which is of sexual nature, all of this is covered under the law. Let's say a colleague of the woman employee sends inappropriate messages even after work. Even that constitutes to be sexual harassment, right? The offense need not occur in the office itself. It need not occur at the workplace itself. If a colleague is harassing a woman employee sexually, even out of workplace, even that constitutes sexual harassment. Any unnecessary contact, seeking of sexual favors, sexual advances, or showing pornography, any verbal, non-verbal misconduct, all of this is covered under the law. So in that regard, this is a watertight law. It's one of the most important provisions of the law. It covers almost every aspect of sexual harassment at workplace. Next, under the Act, all women employees, irrespective of their type of employment, are covered under the legislation. It could be a full-time employee or a part-time employee or a freelancer or a contractual employee, someone who's working for daily wages, irrespective of their type of employment. All women employees of an organization are covered under the law. That is the second most important provision of this legislation. Next, the third important point. All public and private sector organizations throughout India are covered under the law. That's why I told you every government institution, private companies, NGOs, every institution gets covered as long as they are operating in India. Next, companies or institutions which employ more than 10 people, they have to mandatorily set up the ICC or the Internal Complaints Committee. If women employees have to report cases of sexual harassment, there should be a easy platform where they can approach and easily raise their complaints. And this should be an independent, transparent process where justice should be done to that woman. So to ensure this, all the institutions, public, private sector institutions, if they employ more than 10 workers, they have to mandatorily set up this committee called Internal Complaints Committee. This committee will have the mandate to receive these complaints of sexual harassment against women employees. They have to even investigate and conduct an inquiry, following which they have to take action against the accused. So in this regard, the composition of this committee becomes very important for your exam. Since the topic has been in news, specifically Internal Complaints Committee has been in news because the Wrestling Federation of India, which is in the center of attention right now, hasn't even constituted an Internal Complaints Committee. In India, there are around 30 sports-related federations. And according to a study, according to a recent report, only 16 of them have Internal Complaints Committee. The rest, they haven't even constituted this committee, which is mandatory according to the law. These sports federations, they have broken the law, they violated the law by not establishing the ICC. So this was widely covered in newspapers, highlighting the flaw in the law and its implementation. So UPSC might focus on the ICC and its composition. So point number one is that it is mandatory for any institution that employs more than 10 workers to set up the ICC. Point number two is the composition. It will consist of 4 members. The head of the committee has to be a woman. It has to be a senior woman employee from the same organization. 2 members from the rest of the employees. 1 member from a third party, from an external NGO with experience in dealing with sexual harassment cases has to be employed. Essentially, 1/2 of the total members have to be women. That is 50% at least. At least 2 women members have to be there on this committee. And the head has to be a women employee. There can be 2 other employees from the company, including maybe a male member as well. But there should be 1 member from a third party NGO. An external NGO should have representation here. This individual should be an expert, should have experience in dealing with sexual harassment cases, in fighting for justice for women. So such individuals have to be included in the committee. So it's a 4-member committee with a minimum of 2 women representatives with a woman as the head of the committee. So the composition in itself is very, very important for your exam. Please take a note of this. Now, I'm sure many of you will have a question. Sir, what will happen if these cases come up in small companies where there are only 5 employees or 6 employees? Or what will happen to women employees in the informal sector? In India, the informal sector is much more, it employs more people and women employees than the formal sector, right? Most of our workers in India, they're largely in the informal sector. There will be domestic maids, ad hoc employees, daily wage workers who are not registered in any formal system. They're not part of any formal organization. So where are they getting covered? For them, the law provides a special provision where in every district, in each and every district of the country, a local complaints committee will be set up by the district administration. The district authorities, they will have to mandatorily set up a local complaints committee to receive complaints from women employees who are employed in companies or institutions that have less than 10 workers, or even those women employees who are working in the informal sector, like domestic workers, daily wage employees, home-based workers, social workers, etc. They all get covered under the local complaints committee set up at the district level in every district of the country. So this is how the law provides for a holistic coverage. All right. Now, let me take you through the challenges. What are the key problems that have been identified by the Supreme Court and also by several legal experts? There are some important points I'm going to discuss. Please make a note of this. It's very, very important for your mains exam. The challenges could be asked in a mains question. So let's see what hurdles are present. According to many legal experts, the problem really lies in the implementation. It's the implementation part where it is lacking. The Supreme Court, for example, has flagged how only 16 out of 30 sport federations in the country have set up internal complaints committee. The fact that I was discussing earlier. This is based on a recent report that was brought out by one particular NGO. Just around half of our sports federations, national sports federations, have set up this internal complaints committee. Rest of them, they haven't even taken this measure to establish this legally mandated committee. So in these sports federations, if women have a complaint of sexual harassment, where will they go? Whom will they approach? Right? This is the legal process and it's not even being followed by sports federations. If this is the case with national level sports federations, imagine what could be happening in small private companies, in small government departments in the remote areas of the country. There is no oversight. There is no oversight mechanism. Even though the law is being enforced, there is no specific authority or institution which is keeping a check on every institution whether they are setting up the internal complaints committee. That itself is a critical flaw. The court has observed that even where ICCs are set up, even in companies and institutions where ICC has been constituted, the composition has been compromised. The composition of the committee is not according to the law. See, I told you there should be 4 members. A woman should be the head of the committee. At least half of the members should be women. There should be 1 external representative. These conditions have to be met. But Supreme Court has noted that many institutions are not meeting the criteria. In several smaller companies and institutions, internal complaints committee, they don't even have women representatives. They haven't included external members. So they've compromised the very composition itself, thus defeating the very spirit of the law. The law was designed with a specific intention so that the internal complaints committee will have more women representatives and the committee will be headed by a woman. And to prevent any bias within the organization, external representation was also given to ensure independence and neutrality. But many institutions have compromised this, and there is no one to check them and hold them accountable for this. The biggest concern that has been pointed out is with regard to accountability from the companies and the institutions. There is, like I said, there is no authority or institution to check whether the spirit of the law is being followed, whether the terms of the law is actually being implemented or not. If such an accountability system was there, then you wouldn't have a situation where your national sports bodies have not even constituted their internal complaints committee. We will not have a situation where external members are not being included or women members are not being given adequate representation. These cases are happening according to the Supreme Court because of lack of accountability. The law does not specify as to who should be held responsible if there is a failure in implementing the law. If, let's say, a company or organization is not following the terms of the law, it's not very clear as to who should be held responsible. Which authority has the power to hold them accountable? this has not been made very clear. The Ministry of Women and Child Development alone cannot look into its nationwide implementation. The ministry simply will not have the resources to check whether each organization is following the terms or not. So this is one critical legal flaw. In the law itself, there is a major problem. There is a lack of accountability. When accountability has not been ensured through the law, it will give rise to such problems in implementation. Next, experts have pointed out that the law is largely inaccessible to women employed in the informal sector. That is another critical problem. Even though the law is providing for a local complaints committee at the district level to deal with women employees in informal sector, according to experts, it is inaccessible to women. Let's say there is a remote village. In a village panchayat, a sexual harassment case has happened against a women employee. Now, can that women employee go all the way to the district headquarters to file the complaint? Accessibility has become a problem, right? And since these are district level complaints committees, they might be flooded with a number of cases. They may not look into it proactively. So these challenges have come up in implementation. The inaccessibility of local complaints committee for women employees in the informal sector. The next big challenge is the underreporting of such cases. In many cases, women employees will be scared. They'll be worried to report such incidents. Even if they know what's happening is wrong, they might remain silent out of fear of retribution within the company. Imagine a woman risking her career because when she's complaining against her colleagues, or maybe in cases where they are superiors of the women employee, the women employee will always have a fear that they might retaliate, they might fire her from the job, they might cut her salary, they might demote her or humiliate her in the workplace. Those who are in a position of authority, they can misuse their power. So this has resulted in underreporting of cases. Also, the general stigma and taboo surrounding sexual harassment also has led to underreporting of cases. This is where we have to spread more awareness, provide inbuilt legal protection to the women employee. This has been missing according to several legal experts. This is another problem in implementation. Next, the act was formulated with a view that complaints can be more effectively handled within the workplace so that the women did not have to go through daunting criminal justice process. The reason why internal complaint committees were provided under the law is to make it easier for the employee to complain. Because if women have to go to the police and seek criminal justice through the criminal justice process, employees will be deterred because criminal justice process is very hostile, it's time consuming, it's going to be expensive. You have to run around between police stations and the courts. So because of all those problems, the law made it simpler by providing for internal complaint committees within the organization itself. But here the problem is these committees may not function adequately. And women employees fear repercussions. There have been many cases where internal complaints committees themselves have forced the women employee to withdraw the complaint, especially when case complaints have come against senior executives in companies, large companies. The companies have closed down the cases. They've tried to shut down the cases by threatening the women employee or by offering money as a bribe to take the complaint back. Now, how do you keep a check on these challenges? This is where we need a system for accountability. We need a better, efficient system through the law itself. Maybe a separate authority can be constituted. Right? In the answer, you can suggest that as a way forward. You can suggest the law has definitely made a big change, but these are the problems in implementation. Now, what can we do to change this? Then provide your suggestions. You can suggest maybe a national level authority with state and district level offices, which can keep a check on implementation to address these problems. Then spreading awareness amongst women to encourage them to come out bravely and report these complaints. So these are the suggestions you can provide, 2-3 suggestions to how we can improve the implementation of the POSH Act. All right. So that is why the topic is extremely important. I hope you guys have understood everything. Now, let's take a practice question. I want you guys to answer which of the following statements is or are correct. The POSH Act mandates that employers with more than 10 employees must constitute an internal complaints committee. It also requires every district in the country to set up a local complaints committee to receive complaints from women employees in firms with less than 10 workers and from the informal sector. Let me launch the poll. I think that will make it easier for you to give the answer as well. I'll launch the poll. I'll give you 15 seconds. Read the question again carefully and give me the right answer. Let's see how many of you have understood the topic. Okay, the poll is live. The question is asking which of the statements is or are correct. 10 more seconds to go. Go and give me the answer. Yeah. Hello everyone. Apologies for the inconvenience. There was a slight technical issue and the audio video seemed to not to be working on my side. I hope now everything is clear. Just let me know in the comments if the audio and video is fine. Can you guys let me know with a thumbs up or yes, it's fine? Am I audible? Am I visible? Guys, if I'm audible and visible, kindly let me know in the comments. Okay, now I think everything seems to be fine. Again, apologies for the technical inconvenience. There was some glitch with the audio and video. Now everything is back on track. So, unfortunately, the poll has gone away, but I'm sure most of you would have got the right answer. Let me give you the right answer. The first statement, POSH Act mandates that employers with more than 10 employees must constitute an internal complaints committee. Obviously, it's a correct statement, right? That is what we studied under the provisions of the POSH Act. And companies which don't have 10 employees, which have less than 10 workers, for them, there is a local complaints committee at the district level, which covers the informal sector as well. So statement 2 is also correct. So the right answer is option C, both 1 and 2. Both the statements are correct. Next, we'll move on to an important topic from Indian economy. Let's take up an important topic related to LIBOR. Last week, it was reported that the Reserve Bank of India, India's central bank, has asked all the banks in the country and financial institutions to completely transition away from using LIBOR from the 1st of July 2023. Now, this is a very big development as far as economy is concerned. See, LIBOR is a benchmark interest rate. It stands for London Interbank Offered Rate, or in short, it is LIBOR. LIBOR is a global benchmark for interest rates, and this is used by major banks around the world when they are lending to other banks. This has been the standard around the world for many, many years, but due to a controversy surrounding LIBOR, the Reserve Bank of India has asked all the banks in the country, all the financial institutions in the country, to stop using LIBOR as a benchmark interest rate. It has asked all the banks to completely move away from LIBOR starting from 1st July 2023. Is that clear? In fact, it is not just India. Around the world, central banks are taking similar steps to stop relying on LIBOR. They're moving to a new benchmark interest rate, which is more efficient and more transparent compared to the problems associated with LIBOR. So let me give you more explanation here and help you understand what exactly is the London Interbank Offered Rate. In simple terms, it's a benchmark interest rate, meaning it's the basic minimum interest rate which is levied. All right. Now, without getting too technical, let's make it simpler for even non-economic students as well to easily understand this topic from the UPSC point of view. You just need a basic understanding of this. See, LIBOR, it is administered by the Intercontinental Exchange based out of London. That's why it is named after London, the London Interbank Offered Rate. And the LIBOR benchmark rate is nothing but the interest rate at which one large bank will lend money to another large bank. The big global banks, they often provide short-term loans to each other. Now, for example, you would have heard about JP Morgan, right? Maybe Wells Fargo. Such global banks, which are major banks, they would be providing loans to each other to maintain liquidity, to continue their credit operations. There will be short-term loans being taken by banks where one bank is borrowing from the other. In case of India, maybe SBI borrows from ICICI, right? Or ICICI lends to some other bank in India. This interbank borrowing, for that there is an interest rate which is fixed. Just like me and you as a customer, if we go to a bank, take a loan, there is an interest charge which is levied on us, right? Similarly, when banks are borrowing between themselves for short-term loans, there is a minimum benchmark interest rate, and this is the LIBOR rate, the rate which is levied on interbank exchange for these short-term loans. It is linked with LIBOR rate, or the London Interbank Offered Rate. All right. This was usually a global standard. LIBOR, which is set in London by many major global banks, this was seen as a standard benchmark for banks around the world through which interbank exchange of money was being carried out. To fix this rate, they use a methodology called waterfall methodology. To fix this interest rate on a daily basis, a methodology called waterfall methodology was being employed. Now, let me explain how this works. Every business day, on every working day, that is Monday to Friday, before 11 a.m. at the Intercontinental Exchange in London, all the major banks which are part of the LIBOR panel, they meet. This includes your top banking institutions of the world like JP Morgan Chase, Lloyds Bank, Bank of America, Royal Bank of Canada, UBS, etc. These are some of the biggest names in the banking industry. All right. So these banks, which are considered as the major global banks of the world, they are part of the LIBOR panel. So these bank members of the LIBOR panel, they meet every working day in the morning before 11 a.m. at London time. and they will recommend as to what should be the interest rate for such interbank loans based on their credit data, based on their liquidity situation. Each bank will recommend one interest rate. All right. So all the different interest rates which are referred by these members of the panel, that is taken, and the extreme interest rates which are at the two extremes, the highest and the lowest rate, they are excluded, they are cut off. Now let's say JP Morgan says interest rate should be 9%. Maybe UBS says interest rate should be only 6%. These are the extreme recommendations which have come from the members of the LIBOR panel. Those extreme rates are excluded. They are not even taken into the calculation. The ones which are in the middle, some would have suggested 7%, 7.3%, 7.5%. So that is taken as the median and the average is calculated. The whole idea is to ensure that the LIBOR rate remains as close to the median as possible. Is that clear? So these global banks together decide what is the LIBOR rate. What is the lending rate at which banks will lend to one another for these short-term loans? Now, this benchmark rate will trickle down the economy. If those banks are giving loans to their customers, or if they are creating other products like derivatives, or if they are carrying out a currency swap, for all those other transactions, this becomes the benchmark rate. If for today, LIBOR has been decided at, let's say, just for example, 7.5%. That is the rate at which banks are lending to themselves. Based on loans they take, they will make some products. They will lend it to some financial institution. They will make some derivative products out of it, right? They'll be swapping the currencies. They'll be using it in the F&O market, the future and options market. Like this, banks can create many financial instruments through which they will give out loans and earn profits. So this would be the minimum on which they will charge. If 7.5 is the LIBOR, they might charge 7.8% for the other customers. So this becomes the minimum threshold for the loans that are being provided in the banking system. So this has global application. LIBOR rate is applied almost around the world by central banks. Even India's RBI would look at LIBOR as the reference. And based on LIBOR, we had a local benchmark rate, which is called the Mumbai Interbank Forward Outright Rate, MIFOR. This is the current rate which we were using in India as the benchmark rate, which was linked with LIBOR. All right. This is what RBI and all the banks in the country were following until recently. Now, let me use this infographic to give you a slightly better idea about what exactly is LIBOR. See, take two banks, for example, Bank 1 and Bank 2. To facilitate their day-to-day operations and transactions, banks will be lending to each other. It's very common at the end of the day or at the end of the week, at the end of the fortnight. Regularly, banks will be borrowing from each other. They will be settling their payments as well. They'll be borrowing money as well from other banks. So when a bank is lending out money to another bank, there has to be an interest rate charge for it. That is your LIBOR rate. The LIBOR panel in London would have decided what's the LIBOR rate. This becomes the benchmark at which banks will lend to each other for the short-term loans. Based on this, these banks will create many products, right? They'll use that liquidity to give out fresh loans, to come out with derivatives, use it in the F&O market, etc. All that interest rate which comes after this will be based on LIBOR. It will be a markup on the LIBOR. LIBOR is the minimum. So they will be charging upon this. All their lending, borrowing activity, their security transactions, everything will be higher than the LIBOR rate, slightly higher than the LIBOR rate. This will determine the profits that the bank is going to make. Higher the LIBOR, more the profits for the bank. Is that clear? So this is how the banking and the lending system was working, and LIBOR was the benchmark rate for banks around the world, which was being recommended by their central banks as well. But in the last 15 to 20 years, it has been noticed that LIBOR is being misused. There is a huge controversy surrounding it. It is nothing short of a scandal which has been committed over the years. It has come to light that the LIBOR panel banks, which were the first ones to recommend the daily LIBOR rate, they were deliberately manipulating their records. They were giving false recommendations to the panel to ensure that the LIBOR rate is kept higher. If LIBOR is higher, their profits is going to be higher. This is what some of the major banks were doing. This came to light for the first time during the 2008 financial crisis, which was mainly triggered in the United States. The US housing market bubble exploded following the unsustainable loans that American banks had given out. And the prime reason why American banks were giving out loans to everyone was because the LIBOR rate had been manipulated. It had been artificially kept high. Based on that, they were charging even higher interest rates to their customers, reaping more and more profits. And it became unsustainable to a point where the customers could never repay the loans back. Right? These non-performing assets crashed many top banks, which triggered a global contagion, a global recession that brought down not just the American economy, but around the world, almost every economy took a hit. One of the prime reasons why the crisis happened was because of the manipulation of LIBOR by several top banking and financial institutions. So since then, there has been a call to move away from LIBOR, to move away from the system where major banks are deciding amongst themselves as to what is the benchmark interest rate. So many critics have pointed out that the mechanism adopted by LIBOR, it relied on the data given by the major banks. And since they had a vested interest here, since they could make more profits by giving false reports and accounts, they were fudging the data. Based on wrong data and misreporting, they were pushing for higher LIBOR rates than what was sustainable in the market. This was deliberately done by several top banks, including by institutions like JP Morgan. So as they levied higher rates, it caused a global contagion where loans started failing around the world, turning into non-performing assets. Whereas these banks and financial institutions, which were making products out of it, they would club all the loans and make derivative products out of it. They made massive profits. They made billions of dollars in profits while crashing the economy and hurting the taxpayer and the government. The entire burden of this crisis was borne by the governments, central banks, and the innocent taxpayers, not just in US, but around the world. So since then, there has been a call to move away from LIBOR. Even recently, there were many investigative reports that came out that several top banks are still manipulating LIBOR to make more profit. So this is a threat to the economy itself. It is unsustainable. That is why there is a global push to abandon LIBOR and move to a new benchmark interest rate, which is called SOFR or SOFR, Secured Overnight Financing Rate. This is going to be the new benchmark interest rate, which has been brought out by the US Federal Reserve in 2017. Please note down the point. It's very, very important for your prelims. See, UPSC might ask a basic question on what is LIBOR, why is it used for. It can ask a basic question on waterfall methodology, where banks suggest different rates and the extreme interest rates are excluded from the calculation and the median rates are taken for the average. That is the waterfall methodology. So that could be a simple question. Or a question on the new benchmark rate, SOFR, or Secured Overnight Financing Rate. And who has developed this? US Federal Reserve, the US Central Bank, brought out in 2017. This is a much better, much more transparent interest rate because here the US Federal Reserve, which is a accountable entity to the US government, is bringing out the benchmark rate. It is using repo rates on the collaterals of the US Treasury Department. The US Treasury, the equivalent of our finance ministry, would have given out few collaterals in the form of bonds and government lending. So there, the repo rate at which the funds have been given out, that would be used as a basis for calculating the secured overnight financing rate. This will be more stable, more transparent, because it will have direct government oversight. It is linked to government treasury bonds and government derivatives, and not dependent on private banks, which are interested in profits. So that is why this is a much better system. And India is also going to follow the same model. Around the world, countries are shifting to the SOFR benchmark rate. So the Mumbai interbank forward outright rate is now being modified. The MMIFOR will be the new benchmark rate in India. RBI has said all the banks and institutions in our country should start using modified Mumbai interbank forward outright rate, which is tied with SOFR, the new benchmark interest rate. So this is more accurate, more transparent, and less prone to manipulation, as the involvement of private banks is minimized here. US central bank and US government and the Treasury Department will be involved in determining the rate. So RBI has urged all the banks and given a deadline. In fact, the decision was made few months back itself. Now a final deadline has been given by 1st July 2023. All the banks and financial institutions, when they are giving loans to each other, the benchmark rate they will follow will be modified Mumbai interbank forward outright rate, which is linked with SOFR of the US, the secured overnight financing rate of the US Federal Reserve. Is that clear? So this is something you need to understand. This is more of a prelims topic more than mains, but you never know. There can be a 10-mark question as well, a basic, straightforward 10-mark question asking you what is LIBOR, what was the controversy surrounding LIBOR, and what's the new interest rate. So a simple, straightforward question can come in mains, but mostly it is a prelims topic according to me. Now let's take this practice question. London Interbank Offered Rate, LIBOR, is primarily used for what? 4 options are there. I'll give you 30 seconds this time. I'll launch the poll. Go ahead and give me the right answer. Let's see how many of you really understood. It's not a difficult topic at all. Trust me, it's a very simple topic. Let's see how many of you can get it right. Is it used for determining loans to be given to banks by the central bank? Think about the statement 1. Determine benchmark interest rate at which major global banks lend to one another, or determine the minimum interest rate to be levied on borrowing customers, or none of the above. Even none of the above is an option. Read carefully. Understood what we have discussed? Very good. Very good. Option B. Make a correction. There is a typo here in the options. It is obviously A, B, C, D. So option B is the correct answer. LIBOR is primarily used for determining the benchmark interest rate at which major global banks lend to one another. Is that clear? This is the correct answer. So always think about these topics conceptually. You don't have to by heart. You can just remember that just like central bank gives out money to the banks at repo rate, and there is reverse repo rate that central bank levies on the money that it's taking back from the system. Quite similarly, banks also lend to each other. So when banks are lending to each other for a short-term loan, there is a benchmark rate which was called the LIBOR. Now the world is moving away from it because of all the misuse and manipulation, and the new rate is SOFR. All right, that is it. There are 5-6 points. If you can remember that, you can answer any question. Okay, now let me take a doubt from you. We have covered 2 topics. Let me know if you have any questions. Sir, whatever is given by Byju's related to newspaper, is it enough for covering current affairs? See, the daily current affairs we provide you and the weekly current affairs and the monthly magazine, this should be more than sufficient. Every day we give you the comprehensive news analysis and the Hindu news analysis. We have the weekly webinars on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And you also have the monthly magazine. Trust me, this should be more than enough. It covers almost every topic which has been in news. So you can rely on the material. Is LIBOR applicable to local banks also? Kushi is asking. See, LIBOR is not directly applicable to other local banks. But since LIBOR is the benchmark rate for the big banks, that is the minimum interest rate. It will trickle down. Like an example I gave you. If SBI is borrowing from ICICI at 7.5%, let's say, just hypothetically, if SBI is lending this to its customers, to other financial institutions and derivatives market, the minimum rate will be upon 7.5%, right? So that is the benchmark. LIBOR will not apply directly for the local banks and other institutions. Only the big major banks, they will use LIBOR as a benchmark, and this will trickle down the system. As you come down the system, interest rate will keep on increasing. Every bank in between will levy a slightly higher rate to make some profit out of it, right? So LIBOR will not directly affect the local banks. How LIBOR affects India? LIBOR will affect every country which was using it as a reference. In India, we were using LIBOR as a reference. If the big Western banks are manipulating it, making profits out of it, and if we are following that flawed interest rate, then people are borrowing loans at a higher interest rate. Banks, institutions are borrowing at a higher rate. Eventually, we'll reach a point where some banks have made a lot of profit and others are in a position where they can't repay the loan anymore, and it will lead to the collapse of your banking system itself. That is why it's very serious, and that's the reason why around the world banks are moving away from LIBOR. Is that clear? So it does affect India. It has huge repercussions for India. Sri Lakshmi is asking, sir, please explain the modified Mumbai rate. See, India's RBI, which is our central bank, was using LIBOR as a reference, and we had a local benchmark rate called the Mumbai interest rate, the Mumbai overnight interest rate. Now, since we are switching to a new model, we are not using LIBOR anymore from July, and we'll be using SOFR. The Mumbai rate is being modified. The modified Mumbai rate will be used going forward, which is linked to the new benchmark rate in the US, the SOFR, which is decided by the US Federal Reserve. So that is the modified Mumbai interest rate. Okay. So guys, these are some questions. Don't worry, I'll come back to your doubts again. Let's proceed with the next topic. Very big topic from international relations. Prime Minister Modi has paid a very big visit to 3 countries. I'm sure some of you would be following this development. PM Modi is on a week-long visit to Japan, the Pacific Islands region, and as well as to Australia. Today, as we speak, the PM is in Australia. All right. So let's look at these important developments. Why did the Prime Minister visit Japan? What was so important there? Why did the Prime Minister visit the Pacific Islands region? Right? Those are the 2 important topics we'll discuss in this week. The visit to Australia will be covered next week. Since it's happening today, right? The developments will keep coming in. So the visit to Australia will cover it next week, but let's focus on what happened in Japan and in the Pacific Islands region. So that is the context for you. Prime Minister Modi, he visited Japan because he was invited to participate in the G7 summit, which was being hosted by Japan. India had been invited by Japan to take part in the G7 summit. So that's why PM Modi went to Japan. Next, he has traveled to Papua New Guinea, which is a small Pacific island country near Australia in the Pacific region. Here, Prime Minister Modi has attended a very, very important summit. We're going to discuss that. And finally, he has headed to Australia. In Australia, the Quad summit was supposed to happen. The Quad leaders, that is the leaders of US, Japan, Australia, and India, they were supposed to hold a Quad meeting. But due to the problems in the US, President Biden has cancelled this summit at the last minute, and Quad summit is not taking place right now in Australia. But other than that, India-Australia interactions will continue. PM Modi is also addressing the Indian community in Australia, right? So those interactions will continue, but the Quad meeting has been cancelled. So developments related to Australia, will cover it in the next class. But now let's focus on what happened in Japan and Papua New Guinea. First, a few important facts about the G7 for your prelims. What is the G7? This in itself can be an important question. The G7 is a grouping of developed industrialized nations. It represents some of the world's richest democracies. Is that clear? Greater 7 or the G7. It's a grouping of the developed industrialized democracies of the world. And the 7 member countries are US, France, UK, Italy, Germany, Canada, and Japan. These are the members. The origin of this group traces back to 1970s, to the oil crisis that was witnessed in the 1970s. When the oil crisis happened in the global oil market, then some of the leading democracies of the world and the richest countries of the world, they came together to form a group to look at global financial issues in order to stabilize the global economy and protect their financial interests. Over the years, this group has evolved with addition of new member countries, and eventually it had become the G8 grouping. By late 1990s, early 2000, by addition of new members, new developed and industrialized countries, the group had become the G8. Even Russia was a part of it. Russia was also included as a member. But in 2014, when Russia attacked Ukraine and captured the Crimean Peninsula, and Russia also sponsored a separatist war in Ukraine to destabilize the country, then Russia was removed from the group. The other Western democracies, they removed Russia, they boycotted Russia and threw Russia out of the G8, and thus it came back to becoming the G7. So today it's a grouping of Western democracies, which are all developed industrialized countries, all the rich and powerful countries. So these are the members: US, France, UK, Italy, Germany, Canada, and Japan. So they meet every year to discuss the key global issues, and not just the financial issues. They discuss every issue that could affect the global economy. Because in today's globalized world, any disruption could have an impact on the global economy. So they discuss not just financial issues, they also discuss global geopolitics. They discuss major wars and conflicts which are taking place, including issues related to terrorism, because these security incidents can disrupt the global economy. Now look at Russia-Ukraine war. The moment Russia invaded Ukraine last year, it has disrupted the global supply chains. Food prices shot up, causing inflation around the world, creating shortage of food in many countries. Essential commodities are not reaching on time even now because there is a spillover effect caused by the disruption of supply chains because of the Russia-Ukraine war. So such geopolitical events can also disrupt the economy. So G7 countries take a look at it. Other global issues like climate change, for example. Global warming and climate change is already taking a huge toll on the global economy, right? Extreme weather events, disasters, they have a price to pay. It causes a lot of devastation around the world. Melting glaciers, rising sea levels, increasing incidents of cyclones and floods and droughts, forest fires. This has a huge economic cost. Countries are going to pay the price. People are going to pay the price for that. So this will disrupt the global economy. So all such global issues which can affect the global economy are on the table for discussion by the G7 countries. Now, the most interesting point here is that India has been invited every year since 2019. Please make a note of this point. It's very, very important. It signifies something very important about India. The G7 summit, which is hosted by the member countries on a rotational basis, right? At this summit, every year since 2019, India has been repeatedly invited by the host country. For example, in 2019, France was the host, and France had invited India to participate as a guest country at the G7. Guest countries can be invited by the host. The host country, which is organizing the summit, can invite a few guest countries depending on their like-mindedness, depending on their closeness in their relationship. So France had invited India. This has been followed by every other host for the next few years. Next, US invited India in 2020 when US was hosting the summit. UK was hosting the summit in 2021 and again India was invited. Last year, Germany hosted the G7 summit and again India was invited. So consecutively since 2019, India has been invited as a guest country for the G7. So what does this tell us? It clearly highlights the significance of India in the global economy. It indicates the significance of India in global geopolitics. And it also signifies the close bilateral relations that we share with all the G7 countries. That is why they are inviting India again and again. Be it France, be it Japan, be it Germany, US or UK, they all have very, very close bilateral ties with India. They look at India as a critical partner. They know that India is a major global economy today and a key player in geopolitics. Also, India is a democracy, a liberal democracy, much like these Western countries. So that is why host country after host country, they have repeatedly invited India for the G7 summit. All right, this fact itself is important for your prelims. UPSC might give a statement saying that since 2019, India has been invited for all G7 summits. Correct or wrong? It's a correct statement. Currently, it is Japan which has invited India. Last year, it was Germany. All right. So such facts can be important. You can get a factual question. For mains, this is relevant. If you're writing an answer regarding India's foreign policy or India's prominence in the global economy, you can bring up this point as an example to highlight that India is a major economy and a key player in geopolitics. You can bring up the point that from 2019, every year India has been invited to the G7 summit. Is that clear? So now let's look at the key developments that happened at the G7. Let's go through the key developments and after that, I'll talk about the Pacific Island region. Prime Minister Modi, who addressed the G7, he has made a very big statement, a very important statement. He has called upon all the countries to respect territorial integrity and sovereignty. Now, what does this mean? It means the Prime Minister was sending out a message. A message was sent out by India by making this statement. Can someone tell me to which country is this message meant for? When Prime Minister Modi said that every country should respect UN Charter, the principles of the UN Charter should be respected, and every country's integrity, sovereignty should be respected. When Prime Minister said this, which country was the Prime Minister referring to? Very good. Some of you are getting the right answer. This was an Indian strategy of hitting two birds with one stone. We were referring to our dear neighbor China, which repeatedly violates our integrity and sovereignty. And we were subtly making a reference to Russia as well, which has violated the integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. This is clever diplomacy on India's part. Without taking the name of Russia or China, the Prime Minister has called upon all countries to respect UN Charter and respect integrity and sovereignty of the other countries. Primary target of India is obviously China, which has repeatedly threatened India. Since 2020, it has caused a military standoff in Ladakh by escalating the Ladakh border crisis. China has been gradually eating away at Indian territory, challenging our integrity and sovereignty. This is a breach of UN Charter. China does the same in South China Sea dispute as well, in the maritime dispute. It shows the same behavior in South China Sea with regard to the maritime disputes it has with Southeast Asian countries. So this is a direct hit by India against China. And we are indirectly sending a message to Russia as well, that the war in Ukraine should end. It's hurting everyone. It's hurting the global economy. It's leading to human rights violations. See, India cannot openly blame Russia or target Russia because Russia has been an all-weather friend, a time-tested friend of India, a strategic partner for India, a key supplier of weapons to India, key supplier of oil to India. In every context, Russia has been a true friend of India. So we can't betray Russia or backstab Russia. So India has firmly stayed away from criticizing Russia openly. We have not voted against Russia in any UN resolution. We have abstained from all the votes and we have bypassed Western sanctions as well. But doesn't mean India can allow the war to continue. So, in a subtle, indirect way, we are putting pressure on Russia as well with other countries that such wars have to end. Russia broke the UN Charter, violated international law when it invaded Ukraine last year. Is that clear? So, these are the messages that were sent out by India by reminding the world about respecting the Charter and protecting the integrity and sovereignty of nations. Along with this, there was another big development. Prime Minister Modi, for the first time, met with Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. This is the first time he has met him since the war began. This is the first time they have personally met in person. That also is a significant message from India that we would like Russia to scale back the war, possibly end the war as soon as possible. So, while making these statements, the Prime Minister also said, see, India has resolved all its land and maritime boundary disputes with Bangladesh in a peaceful manner, in line with the principles of the Buddha. India has pointed out to the world as to how we resolved our boundary disputes with our neighbor Bangladesh. India has given an example. We had the land boundary issue with Bangladesh pending from many, many decades. This was recently resolved in 2015 when we signed the land boundary agreement. The enclave issue between India and Bangladesh was resolved through this land boundary agreement, which was worked out through peaceful talks and negotiations. And India even enacted the 100th Constitutional Amendment Act to ensure that this land boundary issue is permanently resolved. Now, we didn't fight with Bangladesh. We didn't act like China or Russia to attack the other country. We didn't threaten Bangladesh like China and Russia does. Rather, through talks and negotiations, we resolved the land boundary issue. We have done the same with our maritime dispute as well in Bay of Bengal. In Bay of Bengal, there was a maritime dispute between the two countries that had come up in 2014, where we filed a case at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. There is an island in Bay of Bengal called the New Moor Island, which had emerged recently following a cyclone. It was a submerged island. It had emerged a few decades ago. Since then, India and Bangladesh were claiming it. And based on that, they were claiming more exclusive economic zone under the provisions of UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So India and Bangladesh, instead of fighting about it and getting into a conflict, we resolved it through talks and negotiations. To protect our friendly relations, we jointly approached the PCA, the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Under the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, PCA is the designated dispute resolution platform for maritime boundary disputes. So we took the matter to PCA, and whatever arbitration award was given by PCA, we followed it blindly. The award went against India actually. PCA ruled that the excess EEZ should belong to Bangladesh, not India. And according to the award, we had to transfer some of India's EEZ to Bangladesh. India accepted this gracefully. We implemented the award as well, and we gave a part of the EEZ to Bangladesh. So that is how India has respected international rules. We have used peaceful methods, principles of the Buddha, to settle disputes as per international rules and law. Now compare this with what China does. In 2016, Philippines had dragged China to the same court over a maritime boundary dispute. That's why the topic is important for your exams. China and Philippines have a dispute in South China Sea over Scarborough Shoal. It actually belongs to Philippines according to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But China has disputed this, and China has even resorted to aggression to threaten Philippines and claim Scarborough Shoal for itself. So in 2016, Philippines had approached the PCA, just like India and Bangladesh, to get a resolution from the arbitration body. The ruling went in favor of Philippines. PCA ruled Scarborough Shoal belongs to Philippines, not to China. During that time, when this award was given, the PCA asked China to behave like India. The PCA gave an example to show how big powers have to behave. PCA said, it told to China that, see, just 2 years ago, India, Bangladesh had this dispute, a similar dispute, and India followed the orders and implemented the orders because it follows international rules and respects integrity and sovereignty. The PCA had asked China to do the same, to be like India, to follow rules like India. That is why these two cases are very important for our exams. But I'm sure you can guess what China did. China didn't care about PCA's ruling. It rejected the PCA award and continues to threaten Philippines over Scarborough Shoal dispute. All right? So you have to be aware of these important points that the Prime Minister has pointed to at the G7 summit. Next, another important point raised by the Prime Minister was a push for UN reforms. The PM has highlighted how the UN does not reflect current geopolitical realities. The structure of the UN is outdated. It is stuck in the World War era. Because all the key powers of the UN have been kept in the hands of UN Security Council, that too in the hands of the P5 countries, the 5 permanent members of the UNSC. Through their veto power, they are controlling the UN and using the UN for their geopolitics. So India has repeatedly complained that UN is ineffective and outdated, and we have been pushing for UN reforms with the G4 countries. India has aligned with Japan and Brazil, all right, and also with Germany, the other contenders for a permanent seat at UNSC. These emerging powers also have sought a permanent seat at UNSC, and they're pushing for UN reforms. So India has reminded the G7 to take forward the reform process of the UN Security Council. That is another important push given by the Prime Minister. All right. The next point I want to raise is the statement given by the G7 countries themselves. At the end of the meeting, G7 countries gave a statement saying that they will build economic resilience for themselves based on a strategy of diversifying and deepening partnerships and de-risking and not decoupling. Now, what do you mean by this? It sounds like a very complicated statement, right? So let me break this down for you. The G7 summit, which was held at Hiroshima, the site where US had dropped nuclear bombs during the Second World War, right? It not only paid tribute to the victims of the nuclear disaster, but it also paid attention to all the major global geopolitical issues. The G7 countries are mainly focused on the aggression of China and Russia. All right? When it comes to China's aggression and its control over global supply chains, Western countries have had a concern since the pandemic broke out. See, China is a manufacturing hub, right? One of the top economies of the world and an emerging superpower. As China controls most of the global supply chains, when the pandemic broke out, it disrupted the global economy. As China shut down its economy, went into a lockdown, it disrupted global supplies of essential items and commodities. Now, this exposed not just an economic risk, but also a geopolitical risk for the Western countries. It made them realize that they can't rely on China so heavily, because China is known to take advantage of this. China is known to exploit the economic dependency of other countries and misuse it for geopolitical gains. Now, India, for example, has a lot of economic dependency on China. We have an import dependency. Our biggest fear is that China will misuse that. It might cut off essential supplies to India whenever there are military tensions between India and China. So that is a case where China misuses its economic dominance to achieve geopolitical gains and advantages. So since then, Western countries have been working to de-risk their economies from China, not decouple. Decouple means cutting off their economy from China entirely. The word decouple means to cut off. Is it clear? To break the ties entirely. Now, Western countries are saying we are not looking to decouple our ties. We are not looking at inward policies, conservative policies to move away from China dependency. Rather, we are going to take de-risking measures. That is, we'll reduce the risk and exposure. This reference is important because when Donald Trump was the president, he had launched a trade war against China, which is an example of decoupling. The American approach under Donald Trump, the Trump administration was to raise tariffs, that is taxes against Chinese aluminum and steel exports, to completely block out China's steel and aluminum exports to the US. So this is an example of decoupling, which is a very harsh measure where you're cutting off your economy from the Chinese economy. And this is not suitable in a globalized world. This will lead to conservative economic policies, inward looking economic policies. So that is why today the Western countries are saying we are not looking at decoupling as a strategy. Rather, we will deepen our partnerships with like minded democracies and we will de risk our economy. That is, we will shift the risk and exposure away from China. We will not cut off China, will not stop our imports, will not stop the dependency on China. Rather, we will create alternate supply chains. We will work with like minded countries such as India. G7 will work with India and other like minded democracies to build parallel supply chains which are not dependent on China. So by doing that, you're reducing your risk and exposure without threatening the globalized nature of the economy. So this stand taken by the G7 is very important. It shows the strategy they are going to follow to cut their dependence on China. Unlike Donald Trump, they will not look to cut off ties with China. They'll not come up with conservative inward policies which will close the Western economies to China. They'll not do that because that will threaten the whole globalized economy. Instead, they will gradually de-risk their economies. They will invest in other countries. They'll encourage their companies as well to invest in other countries other than China. They will create alternate supply chains by working with like-minded democracies. So by doing that, they will de-risk their economies and they'll start diversifying their economic investments. So this is going to be the strategy of the Western countries. And this analysis is very, very important for your mains exam. That's why I brought it up. Even though it's a complicated topic, I've tried explaining it in simple terms in a short time because trust me, this analysis is important for a mains question. There can be a question on these lines. How are the Western countries looking to reduce their economic dependency on China? What is their strategy? What was the new strategy they brought out at the G7 summit at Hiroshima? Explain or analyze. You have to explain that previously the Trump administration was looking at decoupling, that is cutting off the ties through a trade war. But now Western countries are not looking at that. It's not the right strategy because such a policy of decoupling will lead to collapse of the globalized world order. Instead, they are de-risking their economy by investing in other countries, by forming alternate supply chains. So that should be the answer. And that is the strategy you need to understand. Next, the next point here. After the visit to Japan and participating in G7, Prime Minister Modi has traveled to a very important Pacific island country, that is Papua New Guinea. He went there to participate in the Forum for India-Pacific Islands Cooperation, or FIPIC. Please write this down. It's very, very important for your prelims and mains. India is paying a lot of attention to the Pacific Islands region because this region has emerged as the hub of geopolitical competition in the last 1 year. Pacific Island countries are blessed with immense resources and they have a strategic location in the South Pacific. Is that clear? Let me show you the map so you can better understand where the Pacific Island countries are located. This is where Pacific Island countries are located. Is that clear? These are the Pacific Island countries. This mark that I've drawn, within that, the countries that you find, like Micronesia, Marshall Islands, Solomon Islands, Nauru, Kiribati, right, Fiji, then Cook Islands and Tonga and the others. These are the Pacific Island countries. They are located in Central and South Pacific and they have a strategic location in the Pacific region. In this region, these small island countries, they are blessed with very large exclusive economic zones. In fact, some countries have a EEZ, which is larger than India's EEZ. And these countries are very, very small. They are smaller than even some Indian cities. These are very small island countries. Such small countries have a large EEZ, which is larger than India's EEZ. Now imagine the resources present in them: hydrocarbons, fisheries, precious minerals, including strategic minerals. All these resources are found here. So, in such a vital region, traditional powers here were Australia and New Zealand, along with Japan and, of course, the United States. These were the traditional powers in this region. Australia and New Zealand, of course, have a strong military presence. It's right next to their countries. Japan and US also have a strong military presence. The US even had military bases in the Pacific Islands region. This traditional dominance of Western countries is now being openly challenged by China. In the last 1 year, China has made rapid inroads into this region. China's leaders have visited all these countries and they're signing key agreements with these countries. Recently, for example, China has signed a security agreement with Solomon Islands. A security deal has been signed, which will allow the Chinese Navy to be deployed in the Pacific region. It will allow China to develop port facilities and runways on Solomon Islands, which can be used by the Chinese armed forces. So China is looking for similar military and economic agreements with all the Pacific Island countries. So that is why there is intense competition which has broken out here, and it explains why India also is paying a lot of attention to this critical region. Now, Indian Prime Minister Modi has visited Papua New Guinea over here, located next to Indonesia and Australia. This is Indonesia here, and this is Australia. So right next to both Indonesia, Australia, you have Papua New Guinea. And this visit by the Indian Prime Minister is the first visit by an Indian Prime Minister to Papua New Guinea. That's why the visit is important. This is the first ever visit by an Indian PM to Papua New Guinea. All right. This will not only improve India's ties with Papua New Guinea, but it will help us improve ties with all the Pacific Island countries, because we have a forum called the Forum for Indo-Pacific Island Countries, or India and Pacific Island Countries, the FIPIC. A forum has been set up. It was set up in 2014. This is a platform that brings India closer to all the Pacific Island nations. Is that clear? We have a strong cultural link with this region. If you look at countries like Fiji over here, Fiji shares a close cultural link with India because almost 38% of Fiji's population is of Indian origin. They're of Indian descent. Because during colonial period, the British had transported thousands of Indian families as indentured laborers to work in the sugar plantations of Fiji. These families have stayed back, and their next generations, right, they remain in Fiji as Indo-Fijians. They still practice Hinduism, speak Hindi and other languages. So they form a direct cultural link with India. India is very influential in Fiji and also in some of these countries where Indian community can be found. So we want to leverage this, leverage the cultural link and play a key role in the geopolitics of this region. Of course, India is interested in the resources of this region. Plus, we want to help these countries develop. Many of the countries are facing developmental challenges and problems. We want to assist them in their development and gain Indian influence to counter the Chinese influence in this region. So with this intention, India launched the Forum for India and Pacific Island Countries in 2014, and the first summit was held in Fiji. All right. This was followed up with a second summit in 2015 at Jaipur in India. India hosted the second summit at Jaipur in Rajasthan. And now the third summit has happened after a delay. Because of COVID-19, the summits had been delayed for last few years. Finally, the third FIPIC summit has taken place in Papua New Guinea. That's why the Prime Minister has visited this country, to take forward this relationship with Pacific Islands through the FIPIC, the Forum for India Pacific Islands Cooperation. All right. So please take a note of the countries which are part of this forum. Along with India, these are the Pacific Island nations which are part of this important Forum for Cooperation. Is that clear? Please make a note of all the 14 island countries. They are very, very important. Now, what kind of assistance has India announced for these countries through the FIPIC? We have announced large-scale economic and as well as diplomatic support to the region, along with a possible military engagement in the region. This is what India is looking at in the long term. We want to stabilize the exclusive economic zone of these countries here. We are, of course, interested in the resources present in the region. We want to help them jointly exploit the resources. Right? India can play a role by bringing the right technology and investments to assist these countries to jointly exploit the living and non-living resources. We want to ensure that this part of the Pacific remains free and open, because China is known to threaten freedom of navigation in the Pacific. We want to ensure this part of the world remains free and open for all the countries as per international law. So this outreach of India, it is seen as an extension of our Act East policy, as a continuation of our Act East policy. All right. So India has announced funding for all these countries in key sectors like climate change, telemedicine, teleeducation, development projects at the community level, etc. During the first summit in Fiji, all these big announcements were made by India. And during the Jaipur summit in 2015, India has followed up these initiatives along with a call for a UN seat for these Pacific island countries. We are pushing for a dedicated seat at the United Nations, a separate UN seat in the UNSC for these Pacific island countries. So India has announced a grant of $12 million. We have announced a grant of $12 million for development projects in these countries. This is a grant, meaning it's a aid. It's a free fund we are providing. Along with that, a loan of $150 million, a line of credit of $150 million for key projects in the renewable energy sector. Because these countries are highly prone to climate change. Rising sea levels can easily submerge them. So to help them in climate action, India is assisting them with a $150 million line of credit to help them take up solar and wind energy projects, plus a $12 million grant for all of them to take up some development initiatives, high impact development initiatives. Now, if you look at the latest summit which happened just a couple of days ago at Papua New Guinea, India's Prime Minister has promised to fulfill the previous commitments that were made. For example, we had promised the delivery of Jaipur foot, right? The artificial leg which is made in Jaipur, which is very popular, to enable the disabled people, right? India had promised support to all these countries, the island countries, to help the disabled population by supplying the Jaipur foot. Now we have said we will take forward the initiative free of cost and ensure that we supply this. The prosthetic legs or prosthetic limbs will be supplied from India as our assistance to these countries. We've also promised desalination units for all the countries here. All 14 countries will get desalination plants from India to take seawater and convert it into potable drinking water. So these are some new announcements made by India, along with a super specialty cardiology hospital in Fiji, mainly to help Fijians and Indo-Fijians. To help the people of Fiji improve the healthcare standards here, we are going to set up a super specialty cardiology hospital, right? So these are some big announcements made by India during the latest summit. So all these points that I have discussed, any of these points can be picked by UPSC for a question, for a direct prelims question. Now go ahead, try and give the answer for this question. Let's see how many of you can get it right. Very simple question. I'll give you 15 seconds. If you paid attention when I showed you the map, you can answer this question. Which of the following is not a Pacific island country? Samoa, Comoros, Vanuatu, Palau. Which of them is not a Pacific island country? 56%. Only 56% have got the right answer. That's a little disappointing. I was expecting maybe 70-80% will get it right. Around 56% have given the right answer. The answer is Comoros. Does anyone know where Comoros is located? Now go back and see the map which I have shared. You will identify where is Samoa, Vanuatu, Palau. All these are Pacific Island countries. But Comoros is located somewhere else. Does anyone know where it is? In East Africa and Indian Ocean. Very good. Comoros is a small island country next to East Africa in Western Indian Ocean region, next to Mauritius and Seychelles. That is where Comoros is located, not in the Pacific. All right, so B is the correct answer. Next, the next few topics are pretty simple, straightforward, mainly for your prelims. So we can go through them quickly one by one. All right, let's start with the fourth topic, which deals with arsenic contamination. Last week, a report was brought out by a healthcare journal that highlighted the risks posed by arsenic contamination and arsenic poisoning. So that is why I've chosen this topic, as it can be very important for your prelims from the science and technology segment. So let's understand where arsenic is found and what is the risk it poses to human health, right? What's the risk in India? There are some basic facts that I'll take you through. So please make a note of all these points. Arsenic is a naturally occurring element. It occurs in the nature itself. It's a trace element, meaning it's available only in trace quantities. It's not found in large quantities. It's found in trace, very small, limited quantities. It is found in the soil system, in the sediments, in the rocks. Arsenic can be found. Traces of arsenic will be present. And also in the water, in our rivers and lakes, in the groundwater table especially. All right. This is where you find arsenic element to be found naturally. But arsenic has been recognized as a highly toxic element. It is known to be highly toxic to human health and is a serious health hazard for human beings. If the water we consume, the food that we consume, if it is contaminated with arsenic, it can lead to very serious and dangerous conditions. Long-term exposure to arsenic contaminated water or even food will lead to a situation known as arsenic poisoning, that is scientifically referred to as arsenicosis. Please note down the point, all factual points, but please make a note. This is linked with skin cancer. It's a carcinogenic. If you have long-term exposure to arsenic contamination, maybe through soil or through the food crops which are grown in contaminated soil and contaminated water, and if you're consuming groundwater especially, which is contaminated with arsenic for many years, you are at the risk of skin cancer because it is a very dangerous carcinogen. It can affect the bladder as well, the urinary bladder. It can affect the entire excretory system, especially the kidneys. Kidney function, renal function could get very badly compromised because of arsenic poisoning. It can even affect the respiratory system and lead to many skin conditions. All right. Internally, it can affect the blood vessels and the cardiovascular system, and it could potentially lead to death as well. It can lead to a fatal condition because of the multiple health disorders that it can cause. It has been linked with early onset of diabetes, hypertension as well, and even with fertility related disorders, especially low sperm count in men, has been linked with arsenic poisoning, long-term arsenic poisoning. So given the range of disorders it can cause, it has been classified as a human health hazard. All right. So humans can either consume arsenic through water, when you drink the contaminated water, or even the fruits and vegetables which are grown in such water. Those food items will also carry the contamination. The other route is through your skin. Skin can directly absorb it when you're constantly bathing and washing your hand with contaminated water. Even your clothes, when you wash your clothes and when you wear them, the arsenic can remain, traces of arsenic, and over years it can seep into your skin causing all the disorders that we discussed. Is that clear? So the WHO, the World Health Organization, has laid a standard for arsenic consumption. There is a minimum standard, you shouldn't cross this. The permissible limit is minus 0.01 mg per liter. That is 10 microgram basically. 10 microgram per liter. That is the threshold set by the WHO. But within India, India's regulators and authorities, the Central Pollution Control Board, has set 50 micrograms per liter as a threshold. Because see, in a developing country like India, it might be challenging to provide cleaner water, right? Plus, in our country, there is a lot of arsenic contamination in certain pockets of the country. Especially the groundwater table is highly polluted with arsenic in some states. So a higher threshold has been kept around 50 micrograms per liter, but the WHO standard permissible limit is 10 micrograms per liter. Now let me show you a map to help you understand where arsenic contamination is reported in the groundwater table in our country. Please make a note of this. It's very, very important. West Bengal is one state which has been very badly affected by arsenic poisoning. Even Bihar, Jharkhand, Assam, then Punjab and Haryana. All right. Even parts of Uttarakhand and parts of Delhi as well have reported arsenic contamination. Then Gujarat and Maharashtra and Karnataka, along with parts of Andhra Pradesh and Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh. These are some of the most affected regions in India, along with pockets in Uttar Pradesh. Is that clear? So, few parts of northwestern India, southern India and central India, and especially eastern India. These are the places where very high levels of arsenic contamination is reported, particularly in the groundwater table. All right. So based on these essential facts, let's take a practice question. The occurrence of arsenic in groundwater in India was first reported in which state? The question is asking, where was it first reported in India? So think and answer. I haven't mentioned this in the discussion deliberately. If you have read your basic NCRTs, you will know the answer. Even if you have read the newspapers last week, even then you'll know the answer. In which state was the first arsenic contamination reported? Very good. 74% have given the right answer. The correct answer is West Bengal. All right. Next topic, topic number 5. India and European Union both were in the news over something known as Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, also called the Carbon Border Tax. It's a small topic, important for your prelims. So let's see what this topic is all about. UPSC can ask you, what is Carbon Border Tax? It was in news in relation to which relationship of India? It's related to India-EU relations. All right. So you should know what exactly is this Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. All right, let's take a look. See, the European Union has taken a very strict commitment to reduce emissions. The EU, which is focused on creating a carbon market to reduce emissions and move towards a carbon neutral world, it has recently adopted a policy to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 62% compared to 2005 levels by the end of this decade. By 2030, EU countries are planning to cut their GHG emissions, that is greenhouse gas emissions, by 62% as compared to 2005 levels. To achieve this is a very ambitious target. To achieve this, they are not only phasing out their own greenhouse gas emissions within the EU region, but they're also imposing certain restrictions on non-EU members as well. Along with reducing emissions on their own within their own region by transitioning to clean and renewable forms of energy and by establishing a viable carbon market, They're also looking to place some trade restrictions on non-EU members to force them to abide by EU standards. They have proposed the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, also called the Carbon Border Tax, according to which any item which is exported into EU from a non-EU country, all right, any exported item will be taxed according to the emissions that it has contributed to. Understood? I'll repeat the point. Now, let's say India is exporting a certain engineering item to European countries. Let's say there is a machine, a drilling machine that we have produced in India, and Indian exporters are sending this to European countries. Now, European countries, they will check at the border what is the emission released by Indian companies in India while producing this drilling machine. Depending on the estimate of emissions, depending on that, they will levy a tax, an import duty on this particular exported item, which means the other countries, non-EU members, will be made to pay for higher emissions. These products which have higher carbon footprint, they will become unviable in the European market. If higher taxes are paid, the product will become expensive. It can't compete with cheaper products in the European market. This is carbon border tax. Basically, at the EU border, any commodity coming into the EU will be taxed according to its carbon footprint, be it agricultural commodities, industrial items, or manufactured goods. Depending on their emissions, a carbon tax will be levied on them to make the producers pay for the emissions, to ensure non-EU members also follow the emission cuts. So EU countries are saying this is necessary to fight climate change. But countries like India and others, they are opposing it because it's a restrictive trade policy. It's a trade barrier they are creating, which could harm our exports. So that is why India has opposed it. And we are even checking whether this violates the WTO norms. Under World Trade Organization, unfair trade mechanisms are not allowed. A fair and level playing field should be present for trading, for exports and imports. So India and many other countries, they opposed this initiative when it was proposed at the last year's climate change summit that was held in Egypt at Sharm el Sheikh. When COP27 happened last year, Conference of Parties 27, which was hosted by Egypt, during this climate change summit itself, EU had proposed the carbon border tax or carbon border adjustment mechanism. This was immediately opposed by India, China, Brazil, South Africa, all of which have major exports to the EU market. European Union is a big market for Indian exporters. If the carbon border tax is imposed based on emissions, then it will block the entry of Indian products and it will hurt our domestic producers and our exporters. It will hurt our trading relationship. See, right now, EU is the second biggest trading partner for India. It's the second largest trading partner. It is the second largest trading partner for India if you take EU into account. If you just look at countries which are the biggest trading partners for India, the biggest trading partners would be US and China. They are in the top two. If you're looking only at countries, EU is a region, not a country. So if you ask me which are the top two trading countries for India, it is US and China. Some years it is China, which is at the first position. Some years it is US at the first position, right? So they interchange between the first and second position. But if you take EU as well into account and compare them with our trading partners who are other countries, then EU becomes the second largest trading partner in most of the years. Sometimes it has been the third largest trading partner. So essentially, EU is a very significant market for Indian exporters and traders, very critical for our producers and manufacturers. So if such a tax is being brought up, This could be violative of WTO norms and it could hurt India's economic interests. That is why India and other countries have opposed it. And we are including this as part of the FTA negotiations which are going on between India and EU. India European Union are negotiating an FTA known as BTIA, Broad Based Trade and Investment Agreement. As part of the FTA which is being negotiated, we are bringing up this concern and raising this issue while we are checking whether this tax will comply with WTO norms. If it doesn't, and if EU does not resolve it, if it appears to hurt our domestic production, then India might appeal as well against this at the WTO. But right now, experts are saying it will not have an impact on India. It will maybe affect 2% of our exports, not more than that. This is what EU countries are saying and experts are saying. But India is concerned, India is worried. So that is why we are getting clarification from the EU during FTA negotiations. And we are considering bringing this issue at the WTO as well. So a simple question might be asked here. What is carbon border tax proposed by EU? Or this term has been in news in relation to which country or which region, right? So any such basic question can come on the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Next, topic number 6. I would like to give you some basic facts about the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization. The WMO was in news last week because it has issued an alarming report. You might have read in newspapers that global temperatures are going to rise to record levels in the next 5 years. The WMO has given a report in which it has pointed out that the next 5 years, from 2024 all the way till 2029, this period is expected to witness record level temperatures around the world, where we are going to cross the 1.5 degrees Celsius mark, which has been identified as one of the targets under the Paris Agreement to the Climate Change Convention. See, under the Paris Agreement to the Climate Change Convention, the goal is to keep the rise in global temperatures under 1.5 degrees Celsius as compared to pre-industrial levels. We are likely to breach the target in the next 5 years as a result of continuing greenhouse gas emissions, as a result of continuing global warming, accompanied with the El Nino phenomena. The El Nino weather pattern, which is developing in the Pacific region, in the Central Pacific, between Australia and South America. This abnormal warming of the Pacific waters is very bad news for the world, especially for India. El Nino phenomena is known to cause a direct impact on Indian monsoons. It is likely to disrupt Indian monsoons, resulting in deficit rainfall in the country, even leading to drought conditions. It triggers similar drought conditions in many other parts of the world as well, and it is associated with warming of the Indo-Pacific region. The last 3 years, that is from 2020 to 2023, we witnessed the opposite, that is the La Nina phenomena. Is that clear? We were witnessing the La Nina phenomena over the last 3 years, which was good news for most of the world. La Nina is favorable for Indian monsoons. It brings more rain to India. It brings more rain to many other parts of the world as well. All right. So after 3 years of La Nina phenomena, now we are going to witness a El Nino, which has been widely predicted. And this is likely to scale up temperatures along with global warming, which is already underway. The long-term climate change, which we have carried out because of industrial and human activities, along with that, the El Nino weather pattern for the next couple of years maybe will increase global temperatures significantly, so much so that for the next 5 years, we are going to witness record-breaking temperatures. We are going to breach the 1.5 degree mark in several parts of the world. The average is going to cross the 1.5 degree mark, and this increases the risk of droughts, forest fires, etc. All right. So this is what we need to prepare for. The WMO's warning is specific to this period, especially. Within that 5-year range, WMO has specifically warned about this period, 2023 to 2027. In this period, record temperatures are likely to be witnessed, which is going to be a serious concern given that El Nino is going to become a reality soon. It had been 3 years since we had witnessed El Nino phenomena, right? So that is the concern that WMO has raised. Now, there can be a basic prelims question on this organization. It's an important international organization. The World Meteorological Organization, it was established in the year 1950 and it is a UN specialized agency. Please write down the point. It is a specialized agency of the United Nations established in 1950. It was previously known as the International Meteorological Organization. That was the predecessor of this organization. Now it's named as WMO. Its predecessor, the IMO, International Meteorological Organization, it was established from the Vienna International Meteorological Congress of 1873. That's a historical fact. Through the Vienna Congress on International Meteorology, in 1873, the International Meteorological Organization had been set up to keep track of meteorological events, seasonal changes, climate changes, and bring reports regarding that. This was changed to WMO in 1950, and it was given the status of a UN specialized agency in 1951. Now, this specialized agency of the UN functions under the ECOSOC, the UN Economic and Social Council, which is one of the primary organs or one of the principal organs of the UN. Is that clear? ECOSOC, or Economic and Social Council of the UN, it's one of the primary organs of the UN, and under this we have the WMO, which is a specialized agency. And the last point, it is headquartered at Geneva in Switzerland. Understood? It is headquartered at Geneva in Switzerland. This organization brings out few important reports regarding global meteorological parameters like temperature, extreme weather events, rainfall conditions, etc. And the major report it brings out is the status of world climate and greenhouse gas bulletin. These are two important reports brought out by the WMO. Next topic, topic number 7, Mission Deaf Space. Mission Deaf Space was in news because the Defense Ministry of India, Ministry of Defense, has come out with this initiative called IDX, and it has reached a new milestone. Innovations for Defense Excellence, or IDX. It's a flagship initiative of the Defense Ministry to bring out innovation and research and development in the defense sector. This initiative, the IDEX initiative, it is part of Mission Deaf Space that was launched by the Prime Minister last year. That's why the topic was in news. Last week, Defense Ministry announced this milestone under the IDEX initiative, Innovations for Defense Excellence initiative, where the 250th contract was signed. And IDEX is in turn part of Mission Deaf Space that was launched last year in 2022 by Prime Minister Modi. All right. So let's see what is this mission all about. This is an indigenous attempt to develop innovation, to promote research and development that will help the three armed forces of India, along with enabling India's preparation for space warfare. To deal with space-based threats and the militarization of space, we have set up a dedicated military agency called the Defense Space Agency, which is headquartered in Bengaluru. Defense Space Agency is headquartered in Bengaluru. It was recently set up as a tri-service agency in 2019. 2018-2019 was when it was set up, and it's a tri-service agency. It brings all the three services together. It has representation from the Army, Navy, and Air Force. The Defense Space Agency of Bengaluru has been tasked with developing the space doctrine of India, the space warfare doctrine of India, It also has the mandate to carry out space warfare exercises, and it is also tasked with developing defensive and as well as offensive space weapons, such as the anti-satellite weapon that India tested a few years back. All right, anti-satellite weapons are being developed by Defense Space Agency, which India tested as well under Mission Shakti just a few years ago. So ASAT weapon, it used a kinetic kill option to destroy a old satellite, a defunct Indian satellite, thus displaying India's ability to destroy satellites in orbit. If required, we can kinetically kill enemy satellites. That is, we can hit enemy satellite with a projectile, right, with a missile projectile, and take this satellite out of orbit. So as India is advancing its preparedness and capabilities in the field of space warfare, promoting research innovation becomes critical. That is why Mission Dev Space was launched to promote innovation and R&D for all three services through collaboration with Indian startups and Indian private industry. There are 75 specific challenges that have been identified in the space domain. And in these 75 areas, research and innovation is taking place in collaboration with DRDO, ISRO, and the private sector. So the focus is on developing both offensive, defensive capabilities to keep India prepared for the future of space warfare. So under this, several new contracts are being signed and new initiatives are being launched, such as IDEX, the Innovations for Defense Excellence, under which the Defense Ministry has signed more than 250 contracts with private startups and other defense companies. So you should know what exactly is Mission Dev Space. All right. It is a dedicated mission to promote innovation and address 75 challenges with regard to space warfare. The Navy also is a part of the initiative. The Indian Navy has something called 100th Sprint, which is also focusing on research and innovation, including for satellite systems, low Earth orbit and medium Earth orbit satellite systems, dealing with emerging anti-satellite weapons from other countries, right? Even the Indian Navy has launched a separate initiative here called the 100th Sprint. So this is the basic point you need to note down regarding this topic from defense. Coming to the last topic from security, Operation Dwast. This topic was in news because India's NIA, the National Investigation Agency, which is the premier anti-terror agency of the country, it has launched a mega operation, a massive nationwide and as well as a global operation known as Operation Dwast. That is to destroy, to destruct. This is a special operation the NIA is conducting to break the drug cartels in India, which are operating across Indian states and cities, which have global connections, which are in turn linked with terrorist outfits and terrorist entities. There is always a direct link between organized crime and terrorism and terror funding, especially between drug smuggling and drug trafficking cartels and global crime syndicates and terror groups. To break this connection, the NIA is conducting raids across India under Operation Dwast, across Indian cities. Multiple raids have been conducted to break up these drug cartels, which are working with global drug cartels and organized criminal groups, because they have direct connections with terror groups linked with Khalistan movement, linked with Pakistan-based terror groups such as Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, etc. So to break the terror routes of funding, to break terror financing via drug smuggling, these raids are being conducted by the NIA to destroy the local drug syndicates in India and the crime cartels in India, which have connections in Europe, in West Asia, in Australia, and in other parts of the world. By breaking these drug syndicates and crime syndicates, NIA plans to end terror financing for Khalistan outfits based out of Europe and Australia. And it also plans to target Pakistani terror groups like Lashkar and Jaish-e-Mohammed, which receive part of their funds from drug smuggling and drug trafficking. So that is the mission of Operation Dwast, which is a nationwide ongoing exercise, which is led by the NIA. All right. So that is the last topic that I had to discuss for today. And I hope you guys have understood all the topics. We have covered them comprehensively. Do let me know in the comments how the session went. And any doubts, please reach out to us. We will try to get back to you and we'll try to clarify all the questions that you have. So your feedback is very important. I'll take a look at all your comments. So let me know how the session went. I really hope it was helpful and you've learned something today. So any of you, if you guys are giving the prelims next Sunday, all the very best. I really hope all of you crack the exam. And do let me know how the examination goes as well. So that is it from my side. Thanks for watching. Have a good night. Take care.